So thank you everyone for joining us today for our CivEx session and our discussion around really chronic absenteeism and missing too much school. With me today, I have Dr. Lenay Dunn and Dr. Betsy Hargrove. Lenay, why don't I start with you? Why don't you give us a little bit about your background and for everybody that's joined us today?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Lenay Dunn. I'm a director at WestEd, and I am a 2017 Flinn-Brown Fellow. And I'm really happy to be able to be here today to share a little bit about some of this work. My work in education is really around trying to understand policies, systems, contributors to student and system outcomes, and really help studying those and then supporting practitioners in implementing those.
Thank you, Lenay. And how about you, Dr. Hargrove? Can you introduce yourself for us?
Absolutely. Betsy Hargrove, Superintendent of Avondale Elementary School District. And I have the opportunity to be able to implement practices based off of the data that is gathered by our colleagues here today. And I'm very proud to be able to share the work that we are doing. And I say are doing because we're not done. We're always in a continuous improvement journey. I'm just proud to be able to be here today to share that with everyone.
Awesome. And my name is Paul Perrault. I am a Senior Vice President of Community Impact and Learning at Helios Education Foundation and a proud 2016 Flinn-Brown Fellow. I actually had to look up at the map for the year for a second because I was like, wow, I can't believe it's already been 7 years since we've done that. So kind of wanted to talk through our program today and what we really would like to do. So, what we're going to do today is we're going to have really kind of two parts. The first part is we're going to talk about a research study that Dr. Dunn and her team at WestEd partnered with Helios Education Foundation to conduct around chronic absenteeism in Arizona schools, particularly focusing on grades K through 8 over a 4-year period from 2017 to 2021. And what you're going to see, to give out some early findings is that, there's some really big challenges that were already happening with chronic absenteeism before the pandemic. They were exacerbated by the pandemic, and we're still trying to deal with those issues today. And so we'll highlight those issues, talk through them, talk about some of the recommendations that we've been talking about. And then we're going to switch over and we're going to let Dr. Hargrove talk about how she's implementing solutions. So we don't want to come here and just identify a problem and challenges without kind of giving a great example of how you can do something today in your district, your school, your community to actually improve chronic absenteeism. And then third, lastly, we want to make sure we have time for everyone to ask questions or, think about any of the things that might have popped up around the research or other things, and really ask all three of us some questions about this work. I think it's really near and dear to all of our hearts. We've been doing a lot of work about chronic absenteeism over the last couple of years. And obviously, as Dr. Hargrove talked about, really, she has to live this every day as her schools and the districts are all looking for ways to get kids into school. So with that, I'm going to actually kick us over and share my screen, which I always feel is the hardest part of this endeavor, to just get that kicked off. Share that. And then we'll start the slideshow.
And Paul, while you're sharing that, I think that if you'd like to ask a question of us, you can use the Q&A function. I believe the chat is disabled right now, but we do have that Q&A function, and we will be checking that to see what questions you have.
So to think about chronic absenteeism, and thank you, Lenay, sorry to just jump right in, but to think about chronic absenteeism, again, when we did the research aspect of this, we really started thinking about, what could we understand that was happening pre-pandemic and then what was happening after. And we focused on K through 8 because honestly, high school really gets more challenging. The way that attendance is calculated, the way we follow attendance is much different than the K-8 realm. And so our first part of the study really just focuses on that K-8. We're actually continuing to look at the data for 1 additional year, and we're actually going to do the data for all of the high school years as well. So kind of a reminder is today when we're looking at the data, we're looking at K-8. Excuse me. One of the things that to think about is, why is chronic absenteeism so important? Why are we thinking about this so much? And we really started thinking about it as a group and across organizations as we started thinking about the educational challenges that were happening because of the pandemic. As you know, basically in March of 2020, kids mostly went home from school for the rest of that year. So no more attendance was collected, or when it was collected, it wasn't uniform. So it's hard to make out what was happening in attendance. But also connected with that, Governor Ducey had an executive order where, the Department of Education actually had to follow and understand the impacts of the pandemic on students within the state. The department partnering with us, the Helios Education Foundation in different ways, with West Ed and the REL centers and other ways, really kind of we're always looking at different data elements too. And the chart I'm really showing today is kind of, just some unique comparisons from 2019 to 2021 around what we saw in English language arts and mathematics. And, these are not really apples to apples comparisons. The test changed. There was different populations. For example, in 2020, there was no test because students were in school enough to really be able to take the test, where we would have students were out of school because of where the pandemic hit. In 2021, the population, the number of students that were testing did not really hit the same percentage points that it usually hits every year. And so, when we're looking at this, we have to be cautious too. But, that does give you some good idea of what trends were happening. And one of the things that you can see here when we look at the data, if we look at English language arts, if we look at mathematics, one thing is clear is if we look by grade, each of those years, we see that student performance or proficiency, that is, actually went down. And, I'll highlight, we think about a lot and we talk a lot about in the field, third grade, because at the end of third grade, you're typically moving from learning to read to reading to learn. And so, having 46% of the students proficient, then going down to 35%, that raises a red flag of, what's it going to take to catch students up down the road in subsequent years. The drops in math you can see are bigger. Every year, we see big differences in math. And so, as the pandemic was going, as we're thinking about what was going to happen, proficiency was one of the things that were on our mind as we think about closing gaps between students. And that would be one thing if every student was equally, if those losses were equally distributed. But what we see here, and I'm just giving one example in mathematics now, looking at proficiency by subgroups for 2019 to 2021, is that students that typically that we have bigger gaps on, the gaps even got bigger. So if we think of low income students, which you could see with income eligibility 1 and 2, if we think about minority students, for example, if we look at, for example, Hispanics here or Native Americans, we see that students that we already had opportunity gaps in mathematics and in English, those gaps, got bigger during the pandemic. And so thinking about what was causing these issues and how we might catch up, one of the things that a lot of people were noticing is that a lot of students were missing more school. Now, some good news is once 2022 rolled around, Arizona's policies in place, more students were back in school in Arizona. What we did see quickly across grades is that there was kind of an increase in most grades around English language arts and mathematics. And so I just highlight these for you here and show you some background. But again, we're thinking that we're taking different testing populations. The test was actually changing. We're just kind of comparing proficiency rates. But, there was some promise that, maybe our students, that the dips that we saw in the first year after the pandemic, 2021, might bounce back up faster. And in English language arts, we did see, some gains. And even for math, a lot of the parts we saw some gains too. The problem though, is both in English language arts and mathematics, the gains that we did see in 2022 did not rise to the level of what they were pre-pandemic in 2019. So we knew that we were still kind of catching up and probably would be catching up for multiple years. Right now, our kids still in English language arts, mathematics, and other grades haven't really reached the full potential or caught back up from any of the problems associated with the pandemic. So as one of the things that, again, back to what can we do, seeing attendance issues were popping up more anecdotally, but also, kind of nationwide, people started having this discussion around, there was kids that were still missing, that hadn't come back into the system, and B, there was a lot of kids that were coming back in the system, but might be sporadically out longer. And some of that might have been early pandemic from when you were in pods, or if you were trying to, if you were exposed and you would come out. But still, even when some of those kind of things were kind of dissipating, we started seeing that students were still missing a lot of school. And so our research really asked, three things. What are the statewide trends in chronic absenteeism 2017 to 2021? Looking at 3 years prior to the pandemic to really understand how the pandemic impacted chronic absenteeism. And that's why we looked at those 3 years prior to. Which student and school characteristics are most related to chronic absenteeism? So I've talked a lot about student characteristics and proficiency, but there are characteristics of schools or maybe even communities that we see that also might, be showing us some trends in chronic absenteeism. And then what are the preliminary 2021 trends for vulnerable student populations? And, thinking vulnerable, like low income students, groups that are minority students that have traditionally have gaps or opportunity gaps, trying to understand, rural students as well that might not have had as much access. So looking at those vulnerable populations to see where some of those bigger gaps are. Kind of want to start by, before we dig into the data more, is just what is chronic absenteeism and how do we explain it? And so what I put up here is kind of that definition. In Arizona, for school accountability purpose, chronic absence is when a student is absent from a given school for any reason, excused or unexcused, more than 10% of a school's calendar year. So 18 days for a typical school year. That meets 5 days per week. But the challenge is, and I'll tell you, we didn't all know this when we started playing with the data, that definition of chronic absence is within one school. So, if I'm a student in Phoenix Union, let's say Phoenix Bioscience, and I missed 10 or 12 days, and then I move to Yuma, for example, and I'm going to Cibola, and I miss another 10 days. I technically wouldn't be identified as being chronically absent because I hadn't missed 18 or more days within that school. And so that also triggered our thinking that, there's a lot of students, or we thought there would be a lot more students that actually miss more than 18 days across schools that are not being counted as chronically absent. So our alternative definition, when we look at the data, we also think about, for purposes of chronic absence, is thinking about it in the alternative, and that's missing 18 days or more, regardless of the school that you're in. So here we kind of can show you what that looks like when we start using the alternative definition compared to the current definition. So the current definition is the solid blue line from 2017 to 2018, or 2017 to 2021. And you can see it almost is about a 1% difference per year. So, 12% of the current definition in 2017, 13% in 2017. And then 2021, where we ended this study on, it was 22%, obviously kind of showing just the difference, and then 23%. And so, if you think about that, a 1% difference, if it was 100, it would be one more student, of 1,000, it'd be 10, of 10,000, it would, it would be 100. And so as Arizona students, around 1 million students, 1% is around 10,000 students. And so we should be, that is a pretty significant number, even though it's only a 1% difference. So also, we wanted to kind of show, what this means if we think about it over the time and how it impacts throughout the year. And so, this is kind of just highlighting some of the trends that we saw across the years. And I'll start with 17, 18, and 19, those first 3 years. You can see that there's a percentage difference. It increases a little bit between 18 and 19, a little bit more between 17 and 18. But what we can generally say is that about 12 to 15%, 13 to 15% were chronically absent, and staying pretty consistent around 17, 18, or 19. You could see that 2020, though, we were actually on track already to have more chronic absenteeism in February, or chronic absences in February. Again, probably another percent higher. It was showing a little bit higher, but it wasn't going to be, something crazy or really off the rails. And then March 2020, the pandemic hits. Not most students go home. The schools and districts don't know a great way to collect the data to be uniform. And so really chronic absenteeism ends because we're not really looking at attendance at that time. So, and then what happens? 2021, a lot of people, especially in Arizona, will think, well, we're really back to normal in the way that students are going to school. It was far from it. And what we saw is that whether, students were missing school because of other factors or because, they were exposed or other things, really, when we look at those numbers and we follow that line around, we were seeing steep chronic absenteeism throughout the year. And so instead of, that 15% that we were hitting at 2019, we're up to 22, 23% in 2021. And you think about that, let's say there's 1 million kids, in Arizona in K through 8, but really K through 12 is that. But let's say there's 1 million kids in Arizona and it's 23%. That's 230,000 kids that were being chronically absent. And so you start to worry, what does that mean? Number one, it means a lot of kids are missing, classes and curriculum. And I come from, I guess, the old school where, if you're not getting that information in school, if you're not sitting there, you're likely probably not going to do well in school. You're not going to do well on a test or a quiz, or you're not going to be learning those skills to read or those other skills that are going to be important to you. And so that's the challenge. But the secondary challenge is, who is missing school? Because if it's those students that already had those opportunity gaps, if they're actually missing more school than other students, well, then there's a big worry. We're going to have even bigger gaps and students are going to fall farther behind. And then we're going to see inequitable differences when we get to the end, when kids start graduating and deciding whether to go to college or what kind of careers they're going to be too, or even within high school, what kind of classes they could take as in dual enrollment or AP. And so that's why it's so important to understand what's happening in chronic absenteeism. And really why we're kind of really talking about this more and more is we want to make sure that kids are back in school and they're not missing school and falling farther behind, creating more issues for those kids down the road. And with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Dr. Dunn, who's going to talk through some other findings.
Thanks so much, Paul. So as Paul mentioned, when we were looking at this issue, we really wanted to understand what did the context look like before the pandemic. As we know, these differences were really exacerbated, but we wanted to really better understand that. So I'm going to show you a series of data about what things look like before the pandemic, and then I'm going to show you, kind of zooming in on one cohort of students in the middle grades, what that looked like during the pandemic. So before the pandemic, we were looking at the predicted probability for a student to be chronically absent at grade 5 and grade 8, because those are really cornerstone grades for absence. So if you look at the dotted line on here, in the blue set is grade 5, that dotted line, and in the 8th grade, it's the orange dotted line. That's just the average predicted probability of being chronically absent in a year. So we looked at this by race, ethnicity, and by gender. And as you can see, American Indian and Alaska Native students were really the only student group that were going over that predicted probability of being chronically absent. So before the pandemic, that was the predicted probability for American Indian or Alaska Native students. I want you to notice these groups because this is going to look a little different down the road. So just kind of hold on to that information. And then on the next slide, we were looking at other kind of student characteristics. So Paul, if I can get to the next slide. So we were looking at economically disadvantaged students, students served by special education, English learner students, and mobility, so students who were changing schools. So again, same thing, that dotted line gives us the average predicted probability of being chronically absent. So before the pandemic, economically disadvantaged students, students served in special education, and in 8th grade, students who were more mobile, so changing schools, were more likely to be chronically absent. I want you to pay special attention to the English learner group, which is kind of the third down on the slide there. Students who were English learners were no more likely than students who were not identified as English learners to be chronically absent. So again, that changes, so hold on to that information as we move forward. This slide talks a little bit and digs into that idea of that mobile student issue. As we looked at that alternative definition, so if students were moving schools, and we know that started to happen Anecdotally, even more so during the pandemic, as students were enrolling in different schools, as some of their needs were changing. But mobile students, even before the pandemic, were more likely in these different grade levels to be chronically absent. So when we look at by grade level, we know kindergarten and first grade, there's often some early spikes there. But look at that mobile student line. That's that top dotted line. So students who are moving schools, they're moving a lot, and they're more absent from the schools that they are enrolling in. And that kind of U-shaped curve there kind of gives us some indicators of grades to zero in on. And so that 5th to 8th grade, where it really starts to spike, and you see that for really all the different student groups that are here, students that aren't mobile, students that are mobile, it really in those middle grades does start to increase. So that was something we wanted to learn a little bit more about. So those are looking at kind of the student characteristics. And then we wanted to look at the school characteristics. So again, this is pre-pandemic. When you look at the school characteristics that might be leading to more probability of being chronically absent, you can see that students in high poverty schools and in rural schools are more likely to be chronically absent. There's also the alternative school is indicated here. Now that's a smaller population of students who are served in alternative schools, but that also was a school characteristic that was linked to more probability of being chronically absent. I think this interesting piece about the small school in 5th grade, not in 8th grade, there could be some reasons, and would love to learn a little more from folks that are in rural communities or small schools what might be contributing to some of that. But that 5th and 8th grade piece, as that became even more apparent that this was a place to look, we wanted to look at this a cohort of students. So we looked at a pre-pandemic cohort of students. So students that were in 5th grade in 2017 and then in 7th grade in 2019. And then we looked at a parallel cohort who were in 5th grade in 2019 and 7th grade in 2021. So that blue line shows the percent of students in that 5th grade cohort who were chronically absent in 5th grade, 11%. And then by 7th grade, they were 16%, because again, we know that increase is really happening in those middle grades. But if you look at that orange line, that's our pandemic cohort. And you'll see that chronic absence rate doubled in that 5th to 7th grade period. So for, overall, our chronic absence rates doubled for this middle grade cohort in those years. So what we're going to do now is we're going to really dig into some of the 5th to 7th grade cohort by some of the student demographics to look and see what some of those impacts were for different groups. This just we have this here because we want to show that what happens in the 5th grade is highly predictive of what's going to happen in 7th grade. So and that was true before the pandemic and during the pandemic. It's just highly predictive of what's going to happen in 7th grade, what is happening in 5th grade. So, I'm sure Dr. Hargrove can talk a little bit about what, some of those things that they're looking at in their local data, but finding students who are at risk of becoming chronically absent in a longer pattern, you want to really look for some of those issues and patterns, which is why we dug into this one particular cohort. So let's look at what happened during the pandemic for these cohorts. So students who were identified as economically disadvantaged, you'll see, so that's represented on the right side, and students who are not economically disadvantaged on the left. So remember I talked about that overall, it was a doubling of the chronic absence rate. So we see that in the not economically disadvantaged, but in the economically disadvantaged, that is well more than doubled. So, it's hitting students who are economically disadvantaged harder than students who are not economically disadvantaged in terms of their chronic absence from 5th grade to 7th grade. So on the next slide, we look at this data for English learners. And before the pandemic, English learners were no more likely than average to be chronically absent. This is a really difficult one to talk about and to see, because again, that doubling, you see the not English learners on the left side, That rate doubled from 5th to 7th grade, which is consistent with what happens statewide. But for English learners, that rate from 15% to 40% of this cohort, that's a really difficult change. And there's a lot of reasons that could be contributing to that. You know, as Paul talked about, there were you know, different impacts that were happening for the pandemic in different communities. In multi-generational households, there were different decisions being made about if students should go to school or shouldn't go to school to protect families. So there's a lot of things behind this, but for this one cohort of students, that was a really big spike in that number from 5th to 7th grade. Let's look at the next grouping of students. And again, American Indian and Alaskan Native students we saw before the pandemic were more likely to be chronically absent. In this cohort, and remember, this is one cohort of students from 5th grade to 7th grade. So it's a small number of students that are represented, but nearly half of American Indian students in this cohort were chronically absent, which again there are many factors contributing to some of that. Many reservations were holding classes remotely. This does include students who were in online courses and the attendance is being taken for online courses. But again, this is a number that we just want to really think about. How do we support families? How do we support students who have been missing so much school? But I think the other thing to notice on this slide is pre-pandemic, Black, African American, or Hispanic or Latino students were no more likely to be chronically absent. But with this cohort from in 7th grade in 2021, you can see that number well more than doubled. So definitely more than the statewide average for that increase. So it mirrors the patterns that we saw in terms of the student outcomes for academic outcomes, of which student groups were being more impacted by some of the pandemic in this data of the chronically absent students. It shows us there's a lot of work to do, getting students back to be in classes, getting students back to be able to support their learning needs. So we want to think about some implications from this and what this means. So one thing on the next slide, it tells us that this current definition that is really for school accountability. That's why there's this chronically absent definition about one school, is because it's used in school accountability measures. But that may not really give the kind of information that's needed to help practitioners make decisions about who to support early on. You definitely don't want to wait until a student is chronically absent to give the supports that are needed. You want to try to prevent that. But I think also capturing if a student moves from one school in the district to another school, even in the same district, they may not know that student had a lot of absences before they came. And by the time they can get them the supports, it might be a little too late in the process. So really thinking about how are there different definitions that can be used beyond the purposes of school accountability. And then just as we talked about that, the pandemic exacerbated chronic absence for some student groups, and it really was beyond what we saw previous to the pandemic. So economically disadvantaged English learners, American Indian students, Black students, and Hispanic Latino students were the most impacted. So really thinking, how can the state and LEAs and others really provide supports and really help engage student groups who have been most impacted by some of these issues? Want to talk about some possible next steps. So what can we do about this? Because this data, there's some difficult things in this data, and there's a lot of districts and schools who are trying to address this, and we want to help think about how do we do that. So I do think that, looking back on that definition, helping districts and schools have some kinds of measures to identify who might be at risk of being chronically absent. So what are some ways to look at that data? What are some indicators that are early indicators that might help intervene with students early on? Also really helping districts in finding evidence-based interventions to address chronic absence. So because there are groups that have really had these exacerbated changes are there ones, which strategies are really working well, and which strategies are working for which contexts with which student groups would be really important to study. And Paul, did you want to talk about the last one with some of the work we have planned?
Yeah, thank you. And the last one, really kind of thinking how the pandemic, I talked a little bit about earlier, affected chronic absence and dropout rates in high school. And why is that important, and why we want to think about that too is because really, if you start really having chronic absenteeism problems in early grades, you start struggling, you just get disengaged, you start missing more school. Even when we showed our graphic, it looked like chronic absenteeism bottoms out in third grade. And each grade, it gets a little bit higher, really kind of seeing that as that problem starts growing and you get students more disengaged, more likelihood of not finishing high school, dropping out, or even if you do, not having the opportunities to go to college, or really struggling academically if you try to go to college. And so that's why it's kind of really pivotal in us understanding what happened in high school. And plus, we just know nationwide, if we look at different data sources, that a lot of kids left high school, even not as seniors, but earlier, and then just never came back. And so understanding those impacts and how it's impacting Arizona is important.
So as we transition over to Dr. Hargrove, who's going to talk about what this looks like at a local level, we talked about the importance of finding some evidence-based strategies to reduce chronic absence. And there are some really good resources out there about evidence-based strategies that have promise, or that have strong evidence that they are impacting and improving chronic absence. At the heart of them are some examples of things like building positive relationships between students, so with students to students, as well as students to faculty and staff. Those relationship building pieces, there's a lot of evidence that really can strengthen the ties that students have to the school and can really support them coming to school. Also strengthening connections with families, so empowering families with information. There's a lot of evidence-based strategies about how to do that and how to support families in making those connections to school and to help encourage their child to attend. And then there's also some more, and this is more probably in the promising evidence. There are some stronger evidence based strategies around this, but some of this is promising where there's still more to learn. But the idea of addressing basic needs that might be barriers to why students are not going to school, like having breakfast provided by the school, different kinds of transportation, or even laundry access. If students don't have laundry access at home, reliable laundry access at home, having a place where they can do that at school. There's been some really interesting work around that and some really promising evidence of its impact on chronic absence. There's a great attendance playbook that is out there. If you're interested, it kind of breaks down these different strategies and the evidence levels for some of the strategies and really focuses on the solution. So how in the COVID era do you reduce chronic absence, which is just, unfortunately has become even more of an issue in the current context. So I'm excited that, Betsy is going to be able to tell us more about that.
Yeah. And as we hand it over to Betsy, Dr. Hargrove, just wanted to highlight too, that we will make sure that, or our partners at Flynn said that they will make sure that they'll email out or give you access to each of these presentations. So wanted to make sure that I highlighted that as well in case you missed anything or we went a little bit fast. We want to make sure we give an opportunity for you to look back at these resources. So with that, I promise that that Dawn and her team will make sure that you get our slides from today. And with that, Betsy, we talked about kind of the issues and the challenges and what the data was showing us. Talk to us about the work that you've been doing in Avondale and the solutions that you've been implementing.
Thank you, Paul and Lenay. I will tell you, probably just like every one of our listeners, every time I hear you speak and share the data, I get a new, we need to look at that. We need to address that and dig deeper into the data. And you actually are going to see some of the shifts in how we're collecting data and sharing it with our teams, different from the way we were prior to the first time I really dug into this data with you. So thank you so much. So and again, thank you so much for having me here, being able to share the Avondale journey around chronic absenteeism. Just a little bit about Avondale. We're a highly diverse school district just outside of Phoenix, and we have approximately 74% of our students eligible for free and reduced price meals, and just under 6,000 pre-K to 8th grade students. I like to tell the story of Avondale and how our journey with chronic absenteeism literally started with pie. And I share that because we have an incredible community advocate here, not just in Avondale, but across all of Arizona through the United Way Valley of the Sun. Dawn, I know, is on this call, but she called me literally the first time we met face-to-face was over a piece of pie, very similar to the one I'm showing here. And she shared with me that, hi, Betsy, really great to meet you. Let's have some pie and let's talk about chronic absenteeism. And I think probably sat back away from the pie. And I said, well, we don't have a problem with chronic absenteeism. And she said, well, okay, that's great. Have some pie. And we are going to talk about chronic absenteeism because Avondale does have an issue with chronic absenteeism. If you look at the data, I think any district in any school would, after knowing and understanding the true definition of chronic absenteeism and the alternate, even more enhanced definition of chronic absenteeism, that it is something that needs to be addressed. Because if we have anyone missing more than 10% of the school year, there's an issue that we need to address. And so in that moment, in learning more from Dawn around that true definition, I went away with a great place to have pie, but also a lot of work to do in our district, because looking just at the composite data around student attendance and looking at, we have 94% of our students with great attendance. And so we don't need to worry about it. What is hidden within that, though, is what's happening and what is creating that 6%. And that 6% actually is can make up a tremendous number of students who are chronically absent and that we need to wrap back around. At that point, we came back, we talked to our team, and we had one of our assistant principals who really understood this and said, I want to do something about this. And he went back to his site and he said, okay, we're going to attack the chronic absenteeism concerns that we have at our school site. And I'm going to go to this training with a peer network and we're going to make a difference. And I will tell you, tracking that data, he came back the following year and really saw no change. And that actually made him dig in even further. And I will tell you, if we were to reflect on that, the piece that I think we learned from that is it's not one person looking at it. It is everyone looking at it, and is having a lens from multiple areas at the classroom level, at the school site level, at the district level, and how can we make a difference around that. And he really was the pioneer. He was the proof of concept that said, if we bring a team around this and we shine a light on the concerns and the true definition of chronic absenteeism, we can make a change. And within that next year, going from 18% students demonstrating chronic absenteeism to 10.9%. So almost cut it in half in that 1 year by bringing a team and shining a light on it. After that, looking at that proof of concept, we can do that. We can replicate it and engage all of our system principals around the work, attending the trainings, but then coming together to build plans specific to their site and their needs. I love what Lenay said at the end, that when we're looking at that data, there's no one solution. There's absolutely no one solution. There are multiple solutions that some work for a handful of kids, some work for a large number of kids, but when you get right down to it, it is by child, by name, and by need. And we need to really address chronic absenteeism specific to a child and how we can possibly make impact with them and get rid of those barriers or create opportunities to enhance their engagement in school. Both need to be done. So much like everyone else, I feel like our journey, it definitely was not linear. It was all over the place. And with the pandemic, we felt the same results and that across the nation around chronic absenteeism. I'm going to go back to what I said that I think made a big difference, shining a light on it in our attention and focus on it. And during the pandemic, our attention definitively was not on that. As a matter of fact, we were creating patterns of behaviors that not only said, that absenteeism is important, or attendance isn't important. We actually were saying, you need to stay home, and you need to stay home because you have a cough or you have a headache or or whatever. Oh, and by the way, now you need to stay home because you sat next to someone who has a cough and a headache. And we created patterns of behaviors that said school, you're actually disallowed from being in school due to dealing with a pandemic. And those are things that we're going to spend some time undoing, a long time, sadly and frustratingly. But I think that there are things that are happening in Avondale that tell the story of we can turn this around a little bit faster, and we need to stay at it. As I said, 22, 23, we had that refocus. We said that we need to make sure that this is a piece that we are not losing sight of. We retooled that data collection. And as I just said, even since the last time we met with this incredible group, with the West Ed and with Helios, with Paul and Lenay, we've retooled it even again. And up until this point, in January of this year, with some sites that have reduced chronic absenteeism by 20% from last year, up to 60%. And that's really, really exciting data to report. I talk about the fact that it's a multi-tiered approach. It's not one person. It is not one grade level. It is not one school. It truly is involving multiple people. Those classroom connections and relationships, because those are first and foremost with our families. And when situations can't be solved within that grade level group and working through the data and supporting children very specifically, that site support staff, the administrators, the social workers, the counselors, in coming up with additional avenues to be able to connect with children. District systems in Avondale looks like, how do we collect data and how do we share that data and how do we process that data? Not here's the data and do something with it. Here's the data and let's look at it as a team. Let's look at it as a collective group to be able to move forward around that. And then community embeddedness. And that really, I think, has been a game changer in Avondale. Talk a little bit more about that. This is just an example of one of our school sites plans. And I will tell you, even since this was developed, it's been redeveloped and honed and shifted. I think one of the most exciting things that we're doing is one, of course, we want to celebrate change in behaviors and actions, and we're able to do that with kids. We have multiple sites who not just celebrate their students for changes in student attendance, they celebrate parents and bring them up and provide opportunities to be able to celebrate them and let them know the work that they're doing is happening. In addition to that, and this kind of gives you an idea of the retooled work around our district and site data across the top with the multiple colors, that represents really the work that we were doing around collecting that data. And again, you can't wait until day 18, Lenay said it. You can't wait until day 18. At that point, you're done. You've already reached chronic absenteeism. I will tell you still address it. However, you can't wait until then to be able to determine what are some avenues to be able to change that behavior, and what are some of those interventions that you can put in to either incentivize children to come to school for different reasons and engage them in a different way, and or to remove barriers that might be present. But looking across that, the data that has the multiple colors in it, that represents the schools in our district. It represents the students, how many students have been missing 1 to 10 days, 11 to 17 days, and 18 plus days, and tracking that over time by grade level, because it was very important to be able to get that into the hands of our classroom educators, while they can say, oh, you know what, so-and-so has been out. But when they start looking at the data, whoa, actually has been out 10 times and it's October. That pattern definitively will say, if it does not change, the student will be demonstrating chronic absenteeism by the end. The two gray, left and right, the left-hand side demonstrates the district data, the right-hand side demonstrates a school site data. And literally, how do we take a look at all of our subgroups and applying that lens of chronic absenteeism within that? Because we want to be able to address it at that level. And I was looking at, Lenay was talking about EL students, and I actually thought to myself, that our data actually says a little bit of a difference in that. And I literally went, as she's talking, to look at this slide, because if you look at the left down at the bottom, our EL data, our non-EL students actually have higher chronic absenteeism than our EL students, which I find to be intriguing. So of course I want to dig into that. So you've given me even more work to do. Thank you, Lenay. And work for our team to look at it, because when you start looking at the real data, the right data, then it allows you and your team to be able to say, okay, well, what's happening with that? Why is that happening? And asking those questions, and what are those next steps that we need to take in order to affect that differently and create change. Again, with Avondale, when we have that data, we can start talking about change. We can start talking about putting things into place. And I just want to share with this group that we have been able to do multiple things, but these are just three, I think, really telling examples of how we approach things because we were looking at the right data. And I can't emphasize that enough. But at the district level, we were coming out, it was spring of 2021. The students had really no after school activities. We were doing wonderful things online, but it really obviously didn't have that great connection that we wanted to have with children. And they were literally, can we please have some dances? Can we please have some after school activities? And we said at that point, and actually our principal said, we're struggling with our middle school students and being able to get them into school and have them stay in school. We have the last probably 8 to 12 weeks of school left. How do we continue to engage them? How do we do it differently? What can we do? And at that point, we said, we're going to re-engage athletics. And not only are we going to re-engage athletics, we're going to do it with a sweeping change in our district. We used to have 3 different athletic teams during the seasons, and those teams were split between multiple sites. We have 10 sites actually that could be eligible to be able to participate in that, but we combined sites and had cut athletics. So in other words, groups of kids would try out and only a certain number could participate. We said at that point, any number of students, each one of our sites could have teams. They could have multiple teams if they could get students to be on those teams, and literally created short cycles of athletics to be able to engage as many kids as we wanted. That is a demonstration of one of our cheer lines who literally said, we want to be there and want to be a part of it. And we actually have to have a bus separate for our cheerleaders from the team anymore because there are so many students. In my mind, that was a reflection of our team coming together. We've got a problem of practice. Our students are having great difficulty getting to school. How can we engage them differently? And this was an opportunity to be able to do that with resounding results. And we've continued with this model because it's great for kids. A site level example that I think that I've shared in the past is about a family that suffered a tragedy, and the mother of young children passed away, and the stepfather who was taking care of the children, they actually lived outside of the school boundaries, came and said, I can't get them to school. I don't have the opportunity with my schedule to be able to do that. I'm going to need to withdraw our children. And the site principal said, no, let's figure this out. Let's work on some things. Can we figure out a different time? Can we have them come a little bit earlier, and we'll work out a schedule? And they figured out some opportunities for that. And it was not sustainable for Dad. And he came back in and said, I'm sorry, we tried. I can't do it. We're going to need to withdraw our children. At which point the site leader called the district and said, what can we do? These are the things we've tried. We don't want to lose the stability for our children and having them in school. Can we come up with another opportunity for them? And typically speaking, our children who are not within boundaries don't ride the bus, but we called over the transportation. So where's the nearest bus that will get our children over to the school that they've been in attendance? And we're able to allow that to happen and create those avenues for transportations for the family and to continue the stability for our children. The last example is about our community level support. And again, going back to our amazing advocate, Dawn from United Way, she worked with us with our Read on Avondale and developed a collective action group over at one of our complexes when we realized we had high absenteeism there. And we had what we called attendance angels, and we had members of that community out of the bus. And as children were not there to get on the bus in the morning, they were going and knocking on doors and saying, come on, let's go. Let's get to school. The bus is here, and it's time to get there. In addition to that, they created flags, and children who demonstrated improved attendance were able to add ribbons to those flags and be able to celebrate that. The families created those flags, and the attendance angels were recognized through random selections for laundry cards to be able to recognize their efforts. And so just multiple opportunities to be able to bring a community together. And again, these are ways to celebrate, these are ways to remove barriers, and it's definitively more than just one person or one group of people. It's a collective group coming around the lens of chronic absenteeism. And just finally to share, that awareness piece, that piece of pie, thank you, Dawn, that piece of pie that it described for me and explained to me the chronic absenteeism and how we could approach it differently, accepting that, right? Accepting the data and making sure that we're looking at the right data and then creating plans of action. And those are the things that we've been able to do collectively in Avondale that has made impact on our chronic absenteeism rate. And I will share with you, we're not done. We will never be done. As I said earlier, that the even hearing from the lens again of Paul and Lenay and the data that they collected sparked another avenue to be able to look at our data. And we are in a continuous improvement process. We're going to be better today than we were yesterday. We're going to be better tomorrow than we are today. And we're going to continue to move the needle to ensure that our children have that limitless future.
Thanks so much, Betsy. Always inspirational to hear all the things that you guys are talking about. I'm going to kind of ask some of the questions to you, Lenay, that have popped up in the chat, and then want to ask others. If they have questions, please send it in the chat and I'll direct it. Betsy, why don't I start with you on this one? We have a question, and maybe I'll connect it with another question. Why aren't the parents being held responsible for the high school levels of absenteeism, or the high levels of absenteeism? And I guess I would kind of connect that with, have we seen punishment work, or is it taking other kind of interventions to support getting students back at school?
In my experience in 30 plus years in education, I have yet to see punishment as being an avenue that has successfully changed attendance. And I think that honestly, when we have an opportunity to come knee to knee and start talking about developing solutions and removing barriers and coming up with goal setting and coming at it from a team approach, that is where we've seen that positive response. I don't know, I've yet to meet a parent, and I don't believe I will ever meet a parent who would not want their child to be successful. And I don't think that people are actively doing things that are putting their children into sets of circumstances where they're creating barriers. The bottom line is there are barriers to coming to school, whether it's an economic barrier, whether it's a distance barrier, whether it's a set of circumstances within the home that needs to be navigated differently. Whatever it might be, I truly believe, and we have found incredible success coming alongside and being a part of a united group to support children and create new behaviors and create new habits of behaviors and celebrating those.
Okay, perfect. Lenay, I wanted to ask you a question that Taylor posed to us. So any tips? I know you shared that the attendance handbook earlier in the presentation, but any tips for organization and agencies that are not schools, but work with truant students to encourage students and families to improve attendance? And they gave an example that a lot of the kids that they work with in middle school said they won't be held back. So any kind of tips that you might give out there? I'll start with you, Lenay, but then also follow up with you, Betsy.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think Betsy probably has some good, because I know, that they partnered with United Way and others. But I think, those same evidence-based strategies can support. I think it's thinking about what can you do to shore up the supports that are happening at the school. It really is a community initiative. West Ed, we've worked with, it was a community in rural Central California. We were working with the school district, but also with school-based health, other kinds of community organizations that supported the school to address chronic absence. Several years ago, we did a really great project with them, and they had a whole community-wide, like Dr. Hargrove was talking about, a community-wide effort to say attendance matters, and there were posters everywhere. They made it something everyone hooked onto. They put together really great sort of infographics or fact sheets for families in multiple languages so that families could talk about why attendance is important, community groups to talk about it. So if you're not the school, you're not the district, you still have a lot of sway in the community. And I think creating that environment where it says, we all know attendance is important, this is why it's important. And true, students may not be held back because they're chronically absent, but their grades will slip. And that, that's what the issue is. And so helping students and families see that relationship about why is it important to come to school? It's not just, to be there. It's that, it is just to be there, because being there exposes you to the information that you need, to be successful in school. I know Betsy.
I totally agree with what you're saying, Lynette. I think I would add the social aspect to learning. It's one thing to read a book or watch a video. It's another thing to be able to hear the thought process of your peer or the metacognition of the adult who's delivering that instruction. Those are all pieces of learning, and it involves all aspects of your senses. I agree with you 1,000 times over. Attendance Works has been an amazing partner with us, and we've been able to lean into their resources, whether it's data collection or posters that we can print off and distribute throughout our community. We had multiple challenges. We had civic leaders challenging other civic leaders to talk about the importance of attendance, and first responders coming up with really great little skits videos that we're able to share with our community. And it is a community-wide effort. When I think about during that pandemic, and maybe one of the most amazing things that we're able to do, that through our work with building community relationships, we have first responders who are mentors to our middle school students, who, when students were having difficulty getting back into school, it wasn't just the school showing up or the principal showing up or the teacher showing up. It literally was a fire truck showing up with the mentor into the neighborhood, knocking on the door and actually at that point, having to stand 10 feet back and just say, you know what, we need you back in school. This is really important. And that sense of belonging and that sense of something bigger, I think, is a huge piece for children and adults. And we can't do this. I can tell you the amazing things that are happening in our classrooms in Avondale, because we have the most incredible educators. The and are the fact that our community, relationships have just layered in so much more.
I also wanted to ask, I was not familiar with it, but Randy had talked about, are you familiar with Higher Ground, and the community schooling organization based in Tucson? I don't have any kind of, I wasn't familiar with them or some of the work that they've done. Betsy or Lenay, were you?
No, but I wrote it down. I'm going to look it up.
Okay,
Yeah,
well then
thanks.
Randy put that in there. Randy put that in there for everybody to
Thank
see.
you,
So,
Randy.
we can follow up and actually try to see, what's happening down there and see if they're implementing some of the best practices that Lenay, you've talked about, and Betsy as well. It's 2:58. We did have one more question about predicted probability. Lenay, did you want to talk about that for a second? Can you
I
talk
saw
about that?
I saw that question from Heidi, and I wrote that I'm happy to share some more information about that. We have an even fuller report than the brief that you all received that gets into more details on that, but I'm happy to have a deeper discussion about that. But I think the idea is, this is statewide data, and I think that's what's really helpful, is it's a statewide picture, and so it allows us to look at patterns from a really macro level that then, like Betsy said, you can start to then think about how to apply it at the local level and where are there differences. So I think that's the power of being able to look at really statewide cohorts of data. So we appreciate the partnership with the Arizona Department of Ed that allowed us that too. Fantastic.
Well, I want to reiterate that the Flinn Foundation will send out these presentations so that you can take a look at them, dig deeper into the data. We ask you to explore the brief that was done around chronic absenteeism, the deeper report that WestEd did around that as well, and really follow up with any of us if you have any questions. But, on behalf of Lenay and Betsy, wanted to thank you all for joining us today, and looking forward to talk to you all again in the future. Have a good day.